Doolittle dinner. So the MIT Security Studies program has a proud history of communication with and support for the members of our armed forces. Tonight we gather to honor the memory of a great airman and MIT alumni, General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, and to present the Doolittle Award for contributions to air and space power, not aerospace power, as I've been now corrected. We have held this invited speaker series and presented this support annually since 1994. Since 2017, the series has been endowed by Pierre and Amy Chow. Pierre Chow earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from MIT and has had an active career in the aerospace and defense industry. Pierre and Amy are with us this evening, and we thank them for their generosity and support. Thank you. This year's recipient of the Doolittle Award and our speaker this evening is Dr. Brian Weeden, Director of Program Planning for the Secure World Foundation. Before introducing Dr. Weeden, I would like to spend a few moments to first discuss some highlights of Doolittle's career as a pioneer in American aviation and aerospace. General Doolittle remains the only American to receive the country's highest military and civilian honors, the Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. General Doolittle dropped out of UC Berkeley in 1917 to join the Army's Signal Corps to attend pilot training. Although World War I ended before he could fly in Europe, Doolittle quickly became an accomplished pilot. In July 1923, after serving as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer at McCook Airfield in Ohio, Doolittle enrolled in MIT, earning a master's degree in 1924. He went on in 1925 to get the first PhD in aeronautics, not just from MIT, as I understand from Dan Hastings, but from any university in the United States. So note to our graduate students, it is possible to get your PhD in 1 year. Right. So create a new field and we will give you a doctorate. Before turning to the Doolittle raid, for which he's perhaps most well known, I would like to touch on three of his other major accomplishments. First, General Doolittle helped to advance many elements of aviation as a test and demonstration pilot. In 1992, he was the first to execute an outside loop. Also in 1992, he became the first pilot to fly from coast to coast in less than 24 hours, completing the journey from Jacksonville to San Diego in 21 hours and 19 minutes with only one refueling stop. Perhaps most importantly, and most scarily, in 1929, he was the first pilot to take off, fly, and land while flying blind in a completely covered cockpit, guided only by instruments that he himself had helped to develop. This accomplishment allowed for instrument-based flying. Second, General Doolittle pioneered the use of high-octane aviation fuel. After retiring from active duty in 1930, he joined the Shell Oil Company. While there, he persuaded the company to develop 100-octane aviation fuel. Such fuel provided a 15 to 30% increase in power over 87-octane fuel, which was the standard at the time. In 1938, Doolittle persuaded the Army to adopt 100-octane fuel, which the British then also used. During World War II, the use of this fuel was credited with enhancing the performance of U.S. and Allied aircraft, extending the range of Allied bombers, and allowing fighters to climb higher and faster, and thus helping the United Kingdom win the Battle of Britain. Third, General Doolittle helped advance space-based reconnaissance. In the 1950s, he served as an advisor to President Eisenhower in several capacities. In these roles, he helped push for the establishment of the Corona Photo Reconnaissance satellite program, which provided the United States with critical information about Soviet strategic nuclear capabilities at a crucial period in the Cold War. Let me now turn to Doolittle's personal valor and bravery during World War II in the planning and execution of what became known as the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, then Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and 79 other volunteers, launched 16 B-25 bombers from the USS Hornet to attack Japan. Getting these heavily loaded twin-engine bombers designed for land-based operations off the deck of a carrier was a major test of flying skill, and certainly not a planned mission for those who designed either the aircraft or the carrier. General Hap Arnold chose Doolittle to lead the, quote, special mission number 1 because he was known as a master of calculated risk, applying skill and science to pull off feats that seemed reckless and daring to others. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed during the mission, 5 were interned in Russia, and 8 became prisoners of war in Japan. General Doolittle himself bailed out over China. He received the Medal of Honor for leading the raid and was promoted from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of full colonel. When Doolittle accepted his Medal of Honor after the raid, he did so reluctantly, saying he would only accept it on behalf of all the men who participated and vowed to spend the rest of his life living up to the honor. Let me add, this was not the only major raid that Doolittle led during World War II. After being promoted to Major General in November 1942, he took command in March of 1943 of the Northwest African Strategic Air Forces, where he led the first raid on Rome and continued to fly. In March 1944, after having taken command of the 8th Air Force in England, Doolittle pushed to lead the U.S. bombing of Berlin, flying in a P-51 ahead of the bombers. He told General Carl Spaatz, quote, having led the first American bombing attacks on both Tokyo and Rome, I would like to lead this one too. Having been briefed, however, on the plan for the invasion of Normandy, his part of the mission was scrubbed. Doolittle retired as a lieutenant general from active duty in 1949, but continued to serve as chairman of the board of Space Technology Laboratories and devoted his time to many other civic and industrial endeavors. At the age of 96, James Doolittle died on September 27th, 1993. As President George Bush remarked in 1989 when presenting the Presidential Medal of Honor of Freedom, as, quote, an aviation pioneer and military hero, James H. Doolittle is a symbol of vision and courage. In the spirit, the James Doolittle Award is given each year to a person, either military or civilian, who has made significant contributions to the advancement of U.S. air and space power. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce this year's recipient, Dr. Brian Weeden, who is the Director of Program Planning for the Secure World Foundation. Dr. Weeden has nearly 2 decades of professional experience in space operations and policy and is one of the country's leading and most widely respected analysts of space policy. At the Secure World Foundation, Dr. Weeden directs strategic planning for future year projects for the foundation and conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, the protection of space assets, and space governance. Dr. Weeden also organizes national and international workshops to increase awareness of and facilitate dialogue on space security, stability, and sustainability topics. Prior to joining the Secure World Foundation, Dr. Weeden served for 9 years on active duty as an officer in the United States Air Force, working in space and intercontinental ballistic missile operations. As part of the U.S. Strategic Command's Joint Space Operations Center, Dr. Weeden directed the Orbital Analyst Training Program and developed tactics, techniques, and procedures for improving space situational awareness. He is a member and former chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Space Technologies, a former member of the Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and former executive director of the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations. Dr. Weeden holds a bachelor's degree of science in electrical engineering from Clarkson University, a master's degree of science in space studies from the University of North Dakota, and is also a graduate of the International Space University in Beijing in 2007. He has a PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University in the field of science and technology policy. Dr. Weeden, welcome and congratulations.
All right. Good evening. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to Taylor and the entire team. I'm deeply honored to receive this award for this year and just hope that the rest of our remarks can live up to that honor. So here goes. As Taylor mentioned, the Doolittle Award is about recognizing contributions to air and space power. And yes, I'm the one who said that aerospace is sort of out of vogue. Nowadays we talk about air and space. The space people kind of like to have their own section of power, but we can talk about that. As we've heard, its namesake was known for its pioneering work in the development and application of air power. I will admit my own military career is just a little bit less impressive than General Doolittle's, but I do think it's been a fascinating journey so far, and it spans both of those categories. So I'd like to think I've been at least a little bit able to make some impact along the way. My career through various twists and turns has focused more on the space portion of aerospace power, and that's what I want to focus on here tonight. I went to college on an Air Force ROTC scholarship to study electrical engineering, and after graduating in 1998, I proceeded to do not anything remotely related to electrical engineering in the military, and that's very common for people who go into the military. My first duty assignment was as an ICBM launch officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base in lovely Great Falls, Montana. And my 5 years there was a study in contrasts. On the one hand, some parts of the job were exceedingly mind-numbing and boring, with an added dose of extraordinary pressure to be perfect all the time across many tests and simulations and evaluations, which is probably to be expected for command and control of nuclear weapons. But it also had some pretty intense moments, including something called code change, which those in the nuclear world is a very complex thing. You change all the cryptography on all these different launch sites. And there was one particular one where we had to invent a new procedure in the field, something you never want to hear from an ICBM officer. And then there was 9/11. I went on nuclear alert that morning and ended up staying in the field for 4 days, sitting there watching TV like many others, only also watching a bunch of other traffic go by. And, you know, the movie where you break open the authenticators, we did some things down there that we hadn't done since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that experience had a profound effect on how I perceive both nuclear deterrence and the concept of aerospace power. For my next duty assignment, I went from sitting underground in Montana to sitting underground inside a mountain in Colorado, where I was stationed at Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Base with the 1st Space Control Squadron. This was my first real exposure to space operations, as we were tasked with monitoring all human space activities in Earth orbit, maintaining a catalog of objects, and providing various warnings and threat assessments to a host of different end users, both in the US military and outside of it. I specifically worked, as was mentioned, as an orbital analyst, tasked to sort through all of the tracking data coming from this global network of radars and telescopes and updating this catalog of space objects. That job got really interesting on the afternoon of January 11th, 2007, Colorado time, when China decided to test their direct-to-send ASAT weapon by destroying one of their own weather satellites. That created about 3,000 pieces of trackable debris, bigger than a softball, much of which still persists in orbit today. While I obviously can't go into all the details about that event, I can say we had a lot of discussions about how to detect and warn against such a threat should it ever be directed at one of our own national security satellites. I separated from the military in 2007, in part because I found love. My wife was a major in the Canadian Air Force. We met as we were stationed together there in Colorado Springs, a good NORAD relationship with the Americans and the Canadians. We got married, and then her next assignment was in Montreal, Canada. And there's not a lot of postings in Montreal for an American space and nuclear expert who can't play hockey. So I got out of the Air Force, we moved to Montreal. But I'll have to admit that perhaps choosing not to do squadron officer school may have had a bit of an impact on my career prospects within the Air Force. So I embarked on a new phase of life, and one that had me exploring these issues of air and space power outside of the military and the government. Shortly after moving to Montreal, I ended up working for Secure World Foundation, this small, newly created, privately funded foundation with a interesting name that nobody knows what it means. And in 2008, we decided to focus on this thing called space sustainability. Little did we know that would turn out to be a big thing. Our mission and the major focus of my work today is trying to help ensure the long-term sustainability of the space environment so that we can use space for all the amazing benefits we get from it today and all the amazing stuff we haven't figured out what to do in the future. A huge piece of that, as was mentioned, looks at things like space debris and traffic management, the growing commercial uses of space, oversight, licensing, all that stuff. But increasingly, a big factor in that sustainability is space power and how it is wielded. Because it's been the case for decades now, the United States has been increasingly reliant on space power for national military power, along with our entire economy. And because of that reliance, there's a growing interest in other countries developing counter-space capabilities to deny our ability to use space. How the United States and other countries deals with those growing threats to space is a major part of my work, and that's what I want to focus the rest of our remarks on. First and foremost, I want to point out this is not a new issue, despite what you may have heard from the media or the remarks from various senior political and military figures. China did not invent anti-satellite weapons in 2007, and that was not the first time they were tested. In fact, the very first anti-satellite test was done by the United States in 1959 as part of a program called Bold Orion, where we were experimenting with using air-launched ballistic missiles for mid-course missile defense technology. And someone, of course, pointed out that if you could do that, you could also launch them at a satellite. And so we decided to figure out if we could actually do that. Between 1959 and 1995, the United States and Soviet Union conducted more than 50 anti-satellite tests in space, including the damage or destruction of 11 satellites that in total created about 1,100 pieces of debris, of which about 350 of those are still on orbit today. Those tests reflect only a subset of the whole suite of offensive counterspace capabilities that were developed, tested, and fielded by both countries throughout the Cold War. So knowing this, I often have to refrain from rolling my eyes whenever I hear someone talk about how space was a sanctuary up until just a few years ago, or up until China had that test 2007, and we've never had to deal with space threats before. It just simply isn't true. We've just forgotten about it because our institutional memory only goes back as far as the latest great idea from whoever's in charge now. It is true that for a brief period following the end of the Cold War, roughly 95, 2005, we didn't have to consider these sorts of threats. And there were some in the United States who envisioned this period of unipolar dominance would persist forever. Those of you who remember the infamous Vision for 2020 published by U.S. Space Command in 2002, and its talk of full spectrum dominance enabled by space and this very cool sort of like Star Wars kind of like logo, and it was very, very visionary. We know this thinking went to the very highest levels of leadership. Of course, we now know with hindsight that that was just a temporary situation, and the kinds of great power threats and challenges we had to deal with during the Cold War would come back around only more so. Because by now, the U.S. has spent the last few decades investing many billions of dollars into space architectures to enable our political desire for global power projection. And then we spent the last 20 years integrating those space architectures into our warfighting capabilities as part of Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and everything else we've been doing for the last 20 years since 9/11. It was only after that Chinese anti-satellite test 2007 that we realized the entire U.S. way of war, and to a large extent our society and economy, was predicated on space architectures and capabilities that were not designed to deal with a hostile adversary, and in fact are rather brittle in the face of attacks. So for the last 15 plus years since 2007, we've seen the bureaucracy struggling with how to address this issue. And struggle it has, because it's very hard for me to point to specific U.S. national space capabilities and explain how we've made them more resilient to attacks. Now, yes, there have been some major changes that have been happening behind the scenes in the classified domains, and I'm not privy to that information. But I suspect that even there, we still have a long ways to go. We certainly talked a lot about making these changes, and I think that is something where actually we've gotten it quite right. From a national policy perspective, we've had a clear direction and set of goals for the last decade plus that have been remarkably consistent given the broader set of political changes over the last 3 administrations. Space is one of those areas there happens to be quite a bit of bipartisan agreement. In 2011, Secretary of Defense and Director of National Intelligence jointly issued a national security space strategy that laid out the problem and direction in broad strokes. It characterized the space environment as increasingly congested, contested, and competitive, identifying trends that are still true today. And you still see that language reflected in a lot of policies and official statements today. It directed the U.S. to promote responsible, peaceful, and safe uses of space, to improve our own space capabilities, partner with responsible nations, international organizations, and commercial firms, prevent and deter aggression against space infrastructure that supports U.S. national security, and prepare to defeat attacks and operate in a degraded environment. All of those goals are still valid today and are largely encompassed by policies and strategies we have today. One of the more contentious parts of that strategy was how to address the deterrence problem. And again, I think the 2011 NSS got it right. It outlined an approach to deterrence that started with establishing international norms and transparency and confidence building measures in space, primarily to promote spaceflight safety, but also to dissuade and impose some international costs on aggressive behavior. At the same time, those norms of behavior would make it easier to identify abnormal behavior that could pose a potential threat. It also pushed for a strategy of denial by by deterrence by denial of benefits, where we would increase the resilience of our own space systems to deny an attacker benefits, including by boosting interoperability, compatibility, integration with allies, distributed constellations, a whole host of things. This deterrence debate represents a long-running argument within the space security policy community over space deterrence. The long-running, I'm not going to recap the whole thing. I suggest to students you look up a guy named Schelling if you haven't read his stuff yet. He has important things to say about deterrence that still hold true. But suffice to say, you can think of deterrence in two general ways: deterrence by threat of reprisal and deterrence by denial of benefits. Our nuclear posture focuses on the former. Any nuclear attacks against the United States will result in a nuclear response of our own, and it's obvious that the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons, coupled with our demonstrated capability to deliver those weapons, makes it a credible threat that will deter nuclear attacks against the United States, or at least that's the theory. But space is a different story. To adopt the deterrence by threat of reprisal model for space poses a different set of challenges, especially the current situation where the United States is by far more reliant on space than our adversaries. What satellites could we hold at risk that would prevent an adversary or convince them not to attack our own satellites? To put a more specific point on this, what Chinese satellites could the U.S. credibly threaten that would deter them from attacking, say, SBIRS or an NRO imagery satellite as part of a Taiwan Straits conflict? The answer, as far as I can tell, is nothing, which means deterrence by reprisal is probably not a valid strategy for protecting our own space assets, at least given the current situation. So the last three U.S. administrations have agreed that deterrence by denial is generally the right approach. The challenge, of course, is saying that and actually doing that has turned out to be two very different things. I've written about this challenge quite a bit over the last decade, and I've had to simplify it down to one not entirely perfect, but good enough for an evening post-dinner conversation. To explain it, I would have to go with disruptive innovation. And for those of you from the business side, you've heard of Clayton Christensen in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, where he lays this out. The book is about why big, successful companies so often fail in the face of new upstarts, when on the surface it seems like these big companies have all the advantages. Clayton reveals that being big and successful has its own share of disadvantages. For example, you have a well-established set of customers that, when asked, just want the same thing you're already giving to them, only faster, better, cheaper. And you can't really afford to ignore those customers, as they're your revenue. And you may be aware all these new technologies coming down the pipeline, but how they'll pan out and whether there'll be a market for them is uncertain. And besides, your current customer is just happy the way things are. And you're really good at what you do, in part because you've built a really complex set of processes and internal knowledge on delivering your current products. In contrast, the new upstart company can take full advantage of those new technologies, and in fact must do so to survive. They don't have to worry about annoying their current customers or a new product destroying existing revenue streams because they don't have any. They also don't have established business units that might feel threatened by a new product or technology. And process change, What process? We're just getting started. Next thing you know, the new upstart, let's call them Apples, roll out a new product. Let's call it the iPhone. And suddenly your customers go, wow, I didn't know I wanted that. And by that point, it's too late. The established company, let's for argument's sake, call it BlackBerry. Anybody actually remember BlackBerry or used a BlackBerry phone? Can't change fast enough in the face of internal resistance and inertia and slowly dies off. Now, you probably by now realize the parallels between this situation in the business world and what the Department of Defense faces writ large. And this happens everywhere, but it's especially true in space. The DoD has a well-established set of customers, the combatant commands and their current operational needs, to whom it provides an established set of capabilities for space, PNT, ISR, protected SATCOM, missile warning, and a whole bunch of other areas. We have new technologies coming in the pipeline. It could be really cool, but we're not sure how they work in any case. We don't really need them for the missions we have right now. And we have a massive bureaucracy that has built up a complex set of processes over the last few decades to deliver a certain set of products, those being large and expensive, but also extremely capable satellites. And we don't really need to change how things work, right? We don't want to change things. So we've seen this struggle to implement this shift in strategy, the shift to resilience, distributed constellations, smaller, cheaper satellites. We've seen that play out over the last decade in all the various national security space organizational changes that have been tried and failed. Fortunately, many people, even those of us who study this, have forgotten about all these changes and focus on just the Space Force as being the brilliant new idea that solved all our problems. And for the students, it wasn't and it isn't. Who remembers the National Security Space Office, the executive agent for space? How about the principal DoD space advisor, the Defense Space Council, the Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Space Operations Directorate, or AFA-11, which was a hot thing for about a minute at Space Symposium, I think in 2017, I think. There was the jokers running the air staff goes to 11, right? What about the Joint Space Doctrine and Tactics Forum, which became the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, which is now called the National Space Defense Center. And oh, by the way, it's part of the Joint Task Force Space Defense. Even my alma mater of OneSpace has become part of this endless cycle of change. Who remembers Space Out of the Mountain with its creation of the JSPOC out at Vandenberg, which is now called the Combined Space Operations Center, and how OneSpace was renamed the 18th Space Control Squadron and moved to Vandenberg. But all the data was still being piped through Cheyenne Mountain because that's where all the infrastructure was. And oh, hey, now they moved some of those people back to Colorado Springs because they had to do some stuff in Colorado. And now they've changed the mission from space surveillance to space situation awareness and now space domain awareness. Still pretty much the same thing they're doing. And now they're called the 18th Space Defense Squadron. And at the same time, we've had all these challenges on the system side. I could spend very long time talking about SPADOC and JMS and all these acquisition programs to resolve some of the challenges that ended up not succeeding. So focusing back to the question at hand, I think there is both good news and also lots of work to be done. The good news is that when it comes to implementing this strategy and building a more resilient space architecture, the leadership currently gets the problem. As we heard last week at the Space Symposium from Chief of Space Operations General Saltzman, the other top leaders, they recognize there is a need to change things and to do so rapidly. General Dickinson, the commander of U.S. Space Command, talked about how hard they are at work defining new sets of capabilities from the combatant command side that will be needed to face challenges and threats they see today and the near future. And there are efforts to try and finally declassify or right-classify space capabilities so that we can actually work with our international allies and partners in space like we do in every other domain. There are also some aspects that have already been changed with the Space Force and U.S. Space Command that are how they're doing business now that give me some hope. The talent acquisition strategy that the previous CSO, General Raymond, released is, in my opinion, a breath of fresh air for recruiting and retaining the kind of skilled personnel the Space Force needs. Because the people and talent that they need to do the space mission are not the same that the Marines need or the Army needs or the Air Force needs for their mission. And they're not going to be able to find and retain people the same way as those other services. And honestly, I think the fact that they have a 4-star Army officer who's in charge of U.S. Space Command and not some fighter pilot or space nerd is probably a good thing, because they actually know what's going on and what the military needs. Although I have a little bit of concern over where they put an admiral in charge. Everyone's seen Battlestar Galactica and how that turns out. I'm not quite sure that's the right way to do it. I am also heartened by the continued bipartisan support for space, as I mentioned, and the general continuity we've seen between the last few administrations, again, despite all the other major political changes, which at least means we're not being wildly pushed back and forth between differing competing visions. But we should not lose sight of the challenges that remain in shifting to this more resilient posture. The kind of organizational change that is required to make it happen, the kind of innovator's dilemma that Christensen talked about, is extraordinarily hard to do. It's hard for companies, and it's especially hard for government bureaucracies. Far more have tried and failed than have tried and succeeded. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you for having me here tonight, and I'm happy to take questions whatever time we have remaining.
So I'll run traffic. You'll be in charge. So I see Dan Hastings, and then everyone else, just leave your hands up. I'll take your name. Okay.
So, in the previous administration, they created the SDA. At least I perceive that as a mechanism to help solve.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? I mean, don't go with the Air Force, create a separate organization, but now it's been absorbed into the Space Force. So what's going on?
No, you're exactly correct, right? If you want to put it simply, the Space Development Agency was created because the existing bureaucracy, Space Systems Command, was not, or by some people's opinion, refusing to change the way they did business. And so we created a whole new organization, which is now off procuring these large constellations of hundreds to thousands of satellites to deliver new space capabilities that aren't being addressed or weren't being addressed by SSC. And now they've been absorbed under. So honestly, I don't know what's going to happen. That's sort of the challenge. On the one hand, hopefully now they're all one organization. They're at least working together, because for a while there it seemed like SDA and SSC were going down different directions and there wasn't a lot of compatibility, so maybe that might change it. But I think there is a risk that this new culture that they've tried to create in SDA might get overwhelmed by the existing culture in SSC, which they're trying to change. But I think they're on the third cultural revamp of Space Systems Command in the last 4 or 5 years, so I'm not sure. So yeah, I think there's a real risk there that might go sideways. I hope it doesn't, because SDA is doing exactly this, right? They are trying to prove out the resilience model, and they're doing so far a pretty good job.
Owen Cote.
Thank you, Ryan. I have sort of basically 2 questions, really only one question, but a preface sort of another, which is, what's your take on the idea that resilience, defined as, I guess, lots of satellites, mostly in low Earth orbit, as opposed to, as you said, several exquisite satellites, usually in geosynchronous orbit, is that actually the solution to protecting space capabilities? So that's one question. But the more important one is, how many things that we do from space now lend themselves to being disaggregated like that over many, many small, cheap platforms? And if there are not several big areas, what are those?
Yep.
And how might we think about solving that problem?
Owen asking the good questions and the really difficult questions. So the short answer is that distributed constellation model is one potential solution, but not the only one. There's actually a really good document put out by OSD Space Policy 2015, I think, or so, called it's called a taxonomy for space mission assurance, I think is what it was called. And I forget, they had like the 6 Ds and the 3 Ps, but they basically had a basket of different strategies, and distributed constellations was one of those. And the thinking was there's this basket of different things, and you need to go to each of those capabilities, PNT, SATCOM, missile warning, and the different arrangement of those 6 or 8 capabilities is probably going to be a different answer for each of those ways you go about it. So for example, GPS is already relatively distributed, right? There's 35 or so satellites, right? There's probably some other things we could do there, whereas things like missile warning was not. So the answer is that distributed constellations are part of it, but are not going to solve everything. And that gets to your second question. Yeah, turns out you can't really disaggregate large optics, or at least easily. Right? Now, there are some interesting things you could do with multiple distributed things, and with a lot of fancy math, you can kind of virtually create large optics, but that's still largely unproven as far as I know. And there's some things about missile warning you kind of have to do from very far away and very cold sensors. So there are some areas where that distributed is probably not going to work, but there's other strategies in that basket, right? You can diversify to multiple orbits. You can, go to maybe other domains outside of space. Crazy thing to think about, right? So yeah, no, that is the challenge. That's why this is so hard. Is they spent, as far as I know, years trying to come up with metrics of how you measure resilience. Well, this is the DoD, right? And so that is partly why they're still trying to figure this out.
Maria Zuber.
Yeah. So, Geo is the new Leo. What do you think about the moon? Is there a future?
Probably not. I mean, this is the big question, right? So I would say, first of all, I am not your usual space advocate. I didn't grow up wanting to be an astronaut, go to the moon, all that kind of stuff. I'm actually fairly, I would say, skeptical about quite a lot of the space settlement stuff. I grew up as a user of space capabilities, so I'm mostly in that world of kind of the robotic satellites and the capabilities. Interesting question. We actually have our organization is holding our Summit for Space Sustainability in New York in June, and one of our panels is going to be on this question of, the title is actually, it's still not a lunar space race is actually the title, because we're trying to get to this point that it's more complex and more nuanced than America versus China, and whoever gets there first is going to kind of dominate. And oh, by the way, that was kind of a mythology we created about the original 1960s space race, if you actually talk to the historians. I think there may be some things there that are worth doing from an astronaut perspective. Not many. I'm not really sold on that.
Zachary Burdett.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the talk. 2 questions. So the first is, I'm curious, we've seen the Russians use mostly cyber and EW in Ukraine in terms of counter space. In terms of the extent that they've only used them to some extent, how much of that do you think is a limitation on their capabilities versus a limitation on their will to use them for whatever reason?
Have you read our report? It sounds like you read our report.
Yeah.
Okay.
Every year, I'm a
Great.
long-time listener, first-time caller.
I'm kind of wondering at what point the kids are not going to understand what that reference is anymore, right?
Well, now you still have these.
It's like I'm a long-time lurker, first-time commenter. I don't know, something like that.
And sorry, can I ask one
Yeah,
more?
sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
The second question is so I think you've laid out well that there's an inflection point now, both in this speech and in your annual report with Roy Sampson and others, that we've reached a moment where we've kind of inherited an efficient but not necessarily resilient space architecture in the post-Cold War period, and that there's been a proliferation of kind of counter space capabilities available to adversaries. And that in the short term, that they pose various problems. I'm curious your forecast, 10 years, right? So if we start to overcome some of these bureaucratic and organizational challenges you've highlighted, how do you see the countermeasure race evolving, right? Mm-hmm. Once we start distributing to multiple orbits, bringing in allies, commercial, et cetera, and I'll focus specifically the question on direct ASATs and then co-orbitals and RPOs, because I know that there's a bunch of things that's covered.
Again, asking easy questions, yeah.
These long-term trends in 10 years, what does this look
Sure.
like?
So I'll start with the easy one. And so he's referencing my organization puts out a report every year. It's an open source analysis of what all these various countries are developing for counter-space capabilities. Myself and my colleague Victoria Sampson co-edited it. And we first started doing it because there was all this concern in the Beltway and elsewhere about, oh, China's doing bad stuff in space, Russia's doing bad stuff in space. Oh, what are they doing? Oh, we can't talk about it. I'm like, okay, great. And so in a desire to have a more informed public policy debate, which I know is a little bit of a dream, we decided to start doing this open source research to see what we could find and put out there to help increase the amount of information. And yes, it is interesting watching what's happening in Ukraine. Again, setting aside the terrible humanitarian tragedy that's happening from a space perspective, because it's not the first space war, but there's a lot of space being used by both sides, and especially commercial space being used by the Ukrainians pretty heavily. When Russia had their anti-satellite test in 2021, there was a lot of pundits that said, oh, this was a warning to NATO and America, don't get involved in Ukraine or we're going to take out all your satellites. If that was their intent, it didn't work. And because they're not using that system, they're not destroying satellites left and right, even the commercial satellites that are being used very effectively by the Ukrainians against the Russian forces. In part because it's not going to matter. They're not going to have an effect. Right? Starlink's got almost 4,000 satellites. I lose track of how many they have up there. You blow up one, okay, great. That doesn't have a meaningful impact on the capability. There's hundreds of commercial imagery satellites providing benefits to Ukraine. Take out one or two of those, it's not going to matter. So from my opinion, I think we're seeing perhaps the beginning of the end for the utility of those kind of destructive anti-satellite weapons. Because China is certainly not launching constellations of 3 irreplaceable satellites. They're launching distributed constellations. Look at their ISR constellations, right? They're not making the same mistakes. So I think as more countries shift, we're going to see this shift away from the destructive capabilities towards the electronic warfare, the cyber. And honestly, for an organization, I mean, look, our goal is not American power, right, as an organization. Our goal is the long-term sustainability of space. We're okay with that outcome, right? If we stop blowing up satellites and it's jamming in electronic warfare, which creates a lot less environmental effects that last for a long time, I would count that a win for sustainability. So yes, I expect to see more electronic warfare, more cyber, because that's how you go after a distributed constellation. And you can actually have militarily some important gains from a good electronic warfare attack if you can pull it off. But that's not going to propagate throughout the rest of the system, and it's not going to create long-standing challenges. The second part of your question was what's going to happen in the future? That is a little more difficult. I mean, if you'd asked, I said, it's been 15 years since America, right, been a little more than 10 years since the US laid out this strategy for space, and yet we're still struggling to actually do it. Are we going to get it done in 10 more years? I honestly don't know. I really, really hope so. Because at the moment, the US is the only country that's kind of relying on a bunch of really expensive, hard to replace satellites. So I can kind of see why potential adversaries might be going after some of those capabilities. But I would have to think with how much attention it's getting, the commercial capabilities coming online, that's going to change. And where does that go? I think space warfare looks like warfare everywhere else. And that you're going to have this, cat and mouse response, counter response game going on. Hopefully we figured out how to have backups and have capabilities in other domains that we don't lose everything. I hope we learn that there may be some very bad things you do in space we just don't do because that's akin to, salting the earth or, nuclear war. But I don't know. That's really difficult.
Jim Walsh.
Thanks very much for your talk. I enjoyed it, and I know nothing about space, and that will be reflected in my question. your last answer, you got me close. I started out with the skepticism, just with the notion that, well, we use the military for space, so our adversaries will find a way to degrade that since we're
Absolutely.
using it.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like that's a pretty basic thing that would be hard to overcome. But then you, in your last question, you started to flesh out, distributed systems, and that seemed persuasive. I guess then the question is that, and then you invoked Ukraine. I don't know that Ukraine is quite the all-in war for Russia. It may get there, but it's not there yet.
Yep.
And if we're in a war, it's probably all in for the people that we're fighting. And of course, not all countries have the same capabilities, so there's probably only a set that could imagine doing something against it. But in this array of the different buckets that you mentioned, how much does that get you? It doesn't get you 100%. Does
Yep.
it get you above the threshold that matters, and what
Yep.
does that threshold, look like? Just those things for the uninformed, that make me think
Yep.
that people will find a way.
No, and to make it clear, I'm not saying we're going to be magically preventing conflict in space, right? It's about changing the way the adversary is going to approach the problem, and what I'm really concerned about are the kinds of the potential things you could do that's going to screw it up for a very long time for everybody, right? That's what I'm hoping we can find ways to take off the table, whether it's diplomatically, whether it's just by the way we structure our systems, because that's what I don't want to see. I'm resigned to the fact that space is going to become a domain of conflict like any others, and we're going to have to manage that as part of future conflicts. And you're absolutely right. Ukraine is not the end of things. There are other scenarios where there might be more that's done. Look, I kind of mentioned Taiwan. That's sort of the thing everyone doesn't talk about here, right? I expressed my frustration to some of my colleagues who work more in that realm and are sort of more on the, I keep saying, why do we have to pick like the most complicated and the hardest thing to like be the entire crux around which we base the future of American power and relationship with China? Because if you had to pick something that was hard, trying to defend a small little island off of the coast of a giant one, we're playing an away game and we have to use space, is extremely difficult. Honestly, I'm not even sure so the goal of having resilience is it degrades gracefully under attack, right? You don't lose it immediately. You lose small percentage, it still functions enough. Right. We all hope that that's our goal, right? As we all get older. But will that be enough in a Taiwan Strait scenario, which is backyard for China? I honestly don't know.
I hate to abuse this. Let me just quickly, and I'll let everyone. 2 questions.
Two more?
So, for the 10 questions, so you mentioned Ukraine, and they're sort of doing okay, doing commercial, right? And I guess my question is, and it's sort of facetious, but maybe just to buff it a little, do you see the U.S. military relying on commercial?
No, but they may now. So this is exactly part of it, right? Some of us have been talking about the military leveraging commercial capabilities for several years now. And there was this institutional reluctance that, it's not built here kind of a thing. We'd rather get the couple $2 billion to build our own stuff than to buy some commercial stuff. And there are some areas like missile warning, right? I'm not quite sure we're ready to outsource that. Nuclear command and control, we probably shouldn't outsource that. But, Starlink has proven pretty dramatically that it can be extremely effective and pretty darn resilient in the face of what I suspect is very sophisticated and sustained electronic warfare and cyber attacks from the Russians. And so far the U.S. military, we talked about the Space Development Agency, right? The U.S. military's like, we don't need that stuff. We get, 5 or 6 GEOs, we're fine, and then SDA says, no, we need to build a military constellation to do this. Oh, that's crazy talk. Well, now they're looking at Starlink going, So I hope that changes. It's happening on the intelligence side with ISR. About 15 or 16, the National Geointelligence Agency, they totally changed their policy, went to an all-source policy saying, we will take data from anywhere we can get it, commercial, unclassified, open source, whatever, and we're going to suck it all in and mix it together, the national systems. And I think they're further along in that area than maybe some of the rest of the military is.
So in the interest of time, I've got one more question. For those of you I can't get to, I'm sure you can come up and chat with Brian a little bit afterwards.
Go hang out at the bar or something.
We got a bar, but no bartender, so this is a dilemma.
That's the ideal situation.
I'm sure there's a bar elsewhere in the hotel.
Yes. I was just thinking of convenience. Roger Peterson.
Well, just to pick up on this commercial and the military, because there's the military, there's commercial, there's academics. And what's the relationship between this? I was the advisor of ROTC here for the freshmen at MIT, and for some students, like, what do we do in the military's business here? We should be pure science, this kind of thing. But the division of labor between the military, and when you get a place like MIT where I think 40% of our budget comes from defense departments, we don't know what happens to that.
Yeah, I would not be surprised.
How much you're going to see all that money, commercial people have a lot of relationships with MIT departments. How much are MIT scientists supposed to be doing just independent scientific research? How much should they be aware of what the country needs?
Well, I mean, I'll just say personally, I'm very glad I did ROTC and didn't go to the zoo for my, my college career, and I got the same commission coming out of a normal college that I would have going to the academy. So I'm thankful for programs like the ROTC. I think it's a much better experience. No disrespect for those who may have gone to the various academies. That's a really tough question, right? Because even some companies struggle with this, right? There have been multiple Silicon Valley companies that have, had employees question taking defense contracts for various ethical reasons to work on, drones and other things. I mean, look, at the very least, the academic world is sort of the centerpiece for a lot of the basic R&D that gets turned into stuff. You mentioned Lincoln Lab, right? I mean, there's a reason why there's a bunch of big radars here that track space objects because a lot of the technology was invented in this area. I don't know. Honestly, I think that kind of depends upon, I would think the American system would shy away from some sort of mandatory participation or support from the academic world into this sort of a thing. But I think there has to be at least some there for just the R&D, right? The question is whether or not, how much of it is people do it because they want to do it, right? As opposed to kind of being forced to, I guess.
But as far as our competition against China, does the United States have an advantage in innovation by keeping
I would hope so.
realms different than having everything sort of merged together?
I mean, I would hope we have an advantage in innovation, because if we don't, that's a problem. And you would like to think that, our system, our democracy, capitalism would lead to that kind of an advantage. I mean, I'm not an expert in those data, and I'm not quite sure if we have, but at least from what I've seen so far in the areas that I focus on, we still have a significant technological advantage and R&D advantage, especially in the commercial world. The relative gap is changing, but for those who've studied economics of innovation, right, S-curves, right, if you're down on a different part of the S-curve, you're going to change much more rapidly than someone who's way up here on the top of the S-curve. And that's where we are with a lot of our space technology. So a big part of it is you're seeing China play catch up because they're iterating through stuff that we did decades ago. And in some cases not moving much faster than we did back then. But relative to us, it appears they're moving much faster through a lot of these technological changes. The question we have is leaping to that next S-curve for the next technology, and that's proving a little bit difficult because of something I talked about, right? The customers are like, hey man, we're doing good just fine the way we are. So how do we do that? That's really the real challenge as far as I can see.
Great. So I have 3 tasks left. The first is to remind those who need a parking voucher that they're on the bar. This comes from Laura, not via space, but via Wi-Fi, which is close. The second task is actually to thank Laura and the entire SSP team, Chris, Olivia, Elena, Andrew, for putting on another excellent event. So thank you, all of you. Last but not least, I now get to present the Doolittle Award, which comes in 2 parts: an MIT SSP tote, which you'll now carry with pride into the office, or wherever you may go. It's useful for lots of different purposes. But much more seriously and importantly, I would now like to sort of formally present you with the James Doolittle Award for your not only your past contributions, but what I can tell tonight, all of the future contributions that you're going to make to the country. So, thank you all for coming out. I'm sure Brian would be happy. I'm volunteering him to entertain a few more questions.
I'm not going anywhere until tomorrow
There are
morning.
lots of hands, but I know I didn't get to all of you. And have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was really terrific.